This is April 4th. We're having another of the oral history interviews. Today we have with us Kenneth O. Thompson. Dr. Thompson, we're delighted to have you with us. I'm Charles Lundquist. We usually start out by letting the interviewee say a few words about his background, where he spent his youth, where he went to school, and how he got to Huntsville and these space activities. So, Ken?
Well, I was born in Canada, and I started school there, but I only went 2 weeks. And my folks moved to Chicago, and I didn't start again until the next year. And by that time, I was 8 years old. Now, in Canada, we lived in a remote area, and I literally rode horseback to school those 2 weeks. But anyway, I started over again in Chicago, and my mother had taught me to read and write, because we were in a remote area. And after about 2 weeks at this new school in Chicago, the teacher used to send me out, "What time is it?" things along that order. I didn't know she was testing me, but she was. And so then I found myself in the 3rd grade, and from then on I progressed, normally, because I was older than most kids in the start. And by the time I was in the 7th grade, my folks moved to a farm in Upper Michigan. It was called Stonington at that time. Now it's a rural RFD, Rapid River, Michigan, the Upper Peninsula. And my brother inherited the farm, and he stayed there until he died last fall. From there, I went into the Civilian Conservation Corps, and I spent 6 years there, and reforestation and things along that order. But fortunately, I had gone to school in Rapid River, and so I could read and write and type and do shorthand and stuff like that. And so when the World War II came along, my brother and I, he's a year and a half younger than, said they were starting to draft, and so he says, "Well, let's enlist, because then we could be together." And so we went down to the recruiting office and so forth, and they were glad to have us because they were gearing up for World War II. World War II hadn't happened yet. It was about a year in the future, but they had already, the U.S. had started the draft. And I was always a skinny kid, and I had a cold and I coughed, and they hauled me out of the line and sent me downtown to get x-rayed. And in the meantime, the line went on, and my brother got to one camp, and I got to another camp. And I didn't see him until my mother's funeral about a year or so later. Then I didn't see him again until after the war, so our idea of enlisting and being together didn't work.
What service did you go into? What branch?
I went into, it turned out to be the field artillery to start with. And obviously I was interested in, then the war came along, and I can remember the progression of that, and how the Germans had gone into Poland, and I just sort of knew that this was the start, really. There was no satisfying them at that point. And so I was trying to get into some kind of a commission, and so I'd applied for the field artillery, and because I was in the field artillery at the time, and I also applied for the Air Force cadets, and they both came through about the same time. And then I had the choice of what am I going to do, because I was pretty sure I could get through the field artillery course. It was only 3 months, and I'd be an officer and that sort of thing if I passed it. But in the Air Corps, I just didn't know. But I figured, gee, if I could get to be a pilot, it'd be I'd learn a trade. And so I opted for the cadets, and I worked my way through, and finally trained and got overseas. And
which theater?
In the Pacific Theater. I started out of Australia into New Guinea and up to the Netherlands, Indies, and so forth. And finally I was shot down off of the Philippines.
What kind of a plane were you flying?
At that time, I was flying a B-25. I started out with the P-38 photo ships, F-4s and F-5s. So I trained as a photo pilot. But anyway, after a while I was there, I got transferred into a B-25 squadron. And I got shot down in the B-25. Anyway, we essentially got rescued in a week. Out in a life raft for 3 days and got on shore and got some help. And I'll tell you, it's a good thing that MacArthur said, "I shall return," because the Filipinos were for the Americans highly, because they've actually taken a chance, you know, to help Americans. And if the Japanese had treated those Filipinos right, I don't think we ever could have got back there. It just wasn't the type of thing, you know, it relied on trust and friendship, or whatever you want to call that thing. And he might have been a big showman, but they needed that. You know, "I shall return," and he come dropping in.
Yes.
And anyway, then I got sent back to the U.S., and I really wanted to get an Air Force commission. But there were just 100,000 pilots looking for a job at that time, and there just wasn't any.
So this was after the war. You wanted to stay in the Air Force.
And I had an average record. I had 65 missions and so forth, but average wasn't enough. You know, in fact, it was the average guy that probably won the war, but nevertheless, you had to do something spectacular. You had to have a college degree. And at that time, I only had high school. And for a while, I worked first as my brother and I bought a grocery store, and I worked with him for a while, but I just didn't want to do that. And I finally decided I was going to go to college. And I looked around, and I was at near Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And the school there, I forget what it is now, the college there, and even the University of Wisconsin at Madison did not have aeronautical engineering. And
really?
I don't know if they have now, but they didn't have then.
I imagine they have now.
Yeah, and so Minnesota had it. And so I flew up there, and boarded a plane, flew up there, and you know, and eventually wound up there. And they had a program that you could get a bachelor's of business and a bachelor's of engineering if you took certain courses and you were in the upper 10% of your class. And so I thought, whoa, that's for me, and I did that. And so I wound up with, you know, the dual degree. And then I got to working for the University of Minnesota as an engineer, as an aeronautical engineer at Rosemount labs. And at that time, they were pretty active lab. And I was doing essentially wind tunnel research and heat transfer and thermal protection. The scheme that we had, Dr. Herman was the leader, to protect against the heat of reentry, was to have water come out the front and be swept on back. And we were testing that with bottles and theory and whatnot, and that was basically what we were doing. And I got my degree, and then I got my master's there. And just sort of, I was working full time, and I stayed in the reserves. I kept up my flying and so forth. And during summer camp, a couple of the times we went to fly on summer camp, and later, because I was an aeronautical engineer, I got put in the engineering field at Wright Field for my training. And I don't know how it happened, but anyway, here the Von Braun lectured the legislature to make a bond issue. And the legislature agreed to that, but they put it out to the public to vote on it as a referendum. and you really got to give the citizens credit. In Alabama, I tell you, if it was Minnesota, you wouldn't have passed, a research thing. You might have got a agricultural better pig farm or something like that. But I'll tell you, when you get to thinking, when they voted for the Research Institute, though it wasn't so much that they wanted the Research Institute. What they really wanted was they wanted a master's degree in Huntsville. But this was the gimmick to get it. This got the professors together, and anyway, when we got the money, and Herman was selected to be the first director of the Research Institute, and he had a pretty darn good record.
Oh, he did indeed.
And he was a kind of a knowledgeable guy in many fields, and charismatic in a certain sense. And I had been his assistant at Minnesota at the Rosemount labs, and I had taken courses from him and so forth. And
so you came here to Huntsville when he did, then, with him?
yeah, I actually preceded him.
Oh, you preceded him?
What it was is I had built up a lot of vacation, and I'd come down here on little trips on consulting to help kick it off, to write proposals and so forth.
Oh.
And once we had the $3 million for the Research Institute, we started to say, what could we do with $3 million? And that sounded like a lot of money, but when we figured out what we really needed, it was $5.2 million. So we said, God, what can we do? Well, we made a plan to do what we call the first phase. The Research Institute was, quote, the first phase. And so before...
Research Institute building.
Yeah. Before I had left Minnesota with Dr. Herman at the Rosemount labs, we had written a proposal, I don't know if it was to NSF or whatnot, to radically upgrade that place. And so we had a lot of the stuff figured out, what we would need, and equipment and people and space and stuff like that. So I had a lot of that stuff to throw into the proposal, you know what I mean?
So you were prepared to write a proposal?
Yeah. And that was one of my main jobs, to write those proposals. And, to try and get the money. I used to call it science fiction. What you do is you imagine what you can do, and you write the proposal. If you get the money, then you really figure out what you're going to do.
And then you have to do it.
And anyway, another thing that we had with the Research Institute, NASA was kind of sponsoring us. The state had given building money, but they didn't give any operating money. So we were operating money. It was pretty darn hard to generate that, so that was one reason we had the research proposal, so the professors and the other staff could, live off of that. And anyway, one of the NASA people, Russ Shelton, you know him well, I'm sure.
Well.
He was the representative of NASA to help the university. I forget his exact title, but that was it.
He was on the Graduate Studies Steering Committee.
Yeah, and he had kept always pushing to have more land. And if we spent the money for land, we couldn't get the research done. So what we finally did, we bought a piece of land that surrounded these houses. There was 11 houses that's now the university has got them. And I was strongly for not buying up those houses at the time, but to get them surrounded because we could pick them up later. And it turned out that's what happened. Well, you really needed them. In the beginning, we didn't need them. We had 300 acres plus or minus here. And we didn't need more at the time. We were going to need more in the future. So we figured by getting them circled, we could get it. Now somebody says, what happens if some big company comes in here and decides they want to build a research building right in the middle there? So it's a research building, great. It wouldn't hurt at all. It turned out nobody did that, but across the way, there's Lockheed and
Milton Cummings and others generated the research park.
Now, to get the second phase, I wrote 2 different proposals to the state to fund the second phase. And both of those proposals were funded. But when we got the money, it didn't go to second phase. One of them went to the physics building, and I forget what the other one went for. Of course, it was building UAH in that sense, but it wasn't.
It didn't help you, though.
Well, it did indirectly, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I was realistic enough to know, like I said, you write the science fiction, that was the proposal, and now if you get the money, you're going to see what you're really going to do with it. Well, they decided that you needed the physics extension more than, in fact, I think they already had part of the physics building, and I think it was the annex to the physics building went that first proposal, which we tried to get as the second phase of the research institute. Now, one thing that a lot of the people weren't really hep on, they called the University of Alabama Research Institute, but initially it was supposed to include Auburn too, but somehow or another Auburn got shouldered out of there, and it really became a creature of the University of Alabama. And it was only much later when there was a split that this became kind of a separate campus and so forth.
Well, finally, Rudolph Herman retired as director of the Research Institute. I guess he had some illness, did he, and then retired?
He'd had a heart attack, yeah. Yes.
What went on during that period?
Oh, I forget the name of the person that took over. He was graduate dean.
Rush?
Rush was different later.
Okay.
There was another one before Rush. Then Rush came in later, yeah. And it became more like a regular university. Now, one thing was what Herman was really instrumental is he doesn't want an institute that's simply a contract research like a company would be. And I remember when Northrop was going to start here, that general, I forget his name now, but anyway, he kept talking to us what it was. He wanted to know what we were going to do because he wanted to know if we were going to compete with them. We would hope to have research in which the students could make a thesis. Just a study where something like that didn't come out, we weren't going to do.
So you and Rudolph Herman were very academically oriented.
He was really academically oriented. If it wasn't going to be suitable for study, thesis, and so forth, then we wouldn't bid on it. Now, you might got hungry and do some things that you really didn't want, but basically we pretty well stuck to that.
Well, eventually you migrated into the engineering department somehow, or engineering school.
Yeah. Well, there's a start. Early on, we just hardly had gotten the money. We got the first grant, and the idea was to get the master's degree here. Well, we had something like 10, 12 professors, or 10, 12, PhD researchers. And that wasn't enough really to give an engineering degree, but Tullahoma was doing it. And so the faculty and Herman and various ones, I didn't participate so much in that because at that time I didn't have a PhD. I was able to take a year off and finish out my studies. At the University of Minnesota, I was in the PhD program, working full-time, but, of course, as long as I could.
So you finished the PhD then by going back to Minnesota for a time?
No, I had to transfer, and I wouldn't say start over because I got an awful lot of credit. I had a master's from Minnesota in my pocket, and I was working on a PhD when I came here.
Okay.
And so a lot of the courses, or several of the courses at least, were transferable. But with a year of full-time study at Tuscaloosa, I could pick up.
To Tuscaloosa?
I had to do the full-time. You couldn't get a degree here.
Mm-hmm.
at that time.
Yeah.
And even when you first started, you couldn't get the PhD here. Later you could.
So you went to Tuscaloosa.
Yeah.
What year was that?
I think it was 64. No, one of my contributions at the University of Minnesota, I was instrumental to getting the computer at the Rosemount labs. The digital computers were just coming in. In town was Univac. And anyway, we came here, and IBM had the arsenal sewed up, pretty much. And other companies, particularly Univac, wanted to get their foot in the door. And I really favored Univac. In my opinion, it was a much better computer than what IBM had at the time. But IBM was a much better salesperson. You know, they really knew how to spread the word. And so what Univac offered to give us half a shift if we'd house the computer. Now, at that time, there was a lot of air conditioning had to go with the computer and the underground subflooring and stuff like that. But we figured we're going to need a computer anyway. So we went for it. And so we got the computer, and half a shift was way more than we could use to start with. The Univac was 300 times faster than what they had at Tuscaloosa. And so right away, I started figuring with Univac, how could we get that capability down to Tuscaloosa? And so we did get a telephone line and a combination printer card reader that could be programmed through the telephone. And so you'd send the stuff down there, or vice versa, send it back up here. Compared to now, it was nothing, but like I said, it was 300 times faster than they had, so you know, it was a tremendous start. And eventually, the university even grew to we kind of needed our own computer, and so eventually the university did get their Univac, the Univac 1107 and later 1108. And
Here in Tuscaloosa?
No, here.
Here.
And Tuscaloosa got one too to start with. Later, I think we shifted to IBM. They had, well, they were good in many ways, and so they essentially out Univac.
What did you do for a thesis?
I did a real gas flow around a reentry body, and this was in the mechanical engineering department. Now, Tuscaloosa did not have a PhD in aeronautical engineering at the time, and I was working on the PhD in aeronautical in Minnesota. But you know, that thing was as aeronautical as you can almost get.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go back to the situation in the University of Minnesota when you were there with Rudolph Herman. How was the organization? Was it the European style with the hair professor and the
No,
or was it
no.
American style?
Herman was a hair professor in a sense, but the place wasn't that way. I'll tell a little story about Herman. He was a tremendous guy, and I was his assistant for quite a while, and I was his student, and it was always Mr. Thompson and Dr. Herman. And anyway, the night I got the PhD, my wife and I and his wife went out to dinner. And finally he reached over and he shook my hand and he's, "Now you can call me Rudolph."
Oh, no, I'm nice.
It was just, I had my place.
Yes, not nice.
Yeah. It wasn't that he was, I don't know what you call it, but anyway.
He was formal in the European style.
Yeah.
At Rosemount, what kind of problems were you working on? Who was funding it?
Well, one thing we worked on was the dinosaur was a kind of almost going to be a space plane. It turned out it was canceled, but anyway, we were doing the heat transfer and checkered flow across gaps and things along that order. We
That
had
was Air Force funding then, or?
Yes. We had tremendous wind tunnel facilities at Rosemount. There was something like 16 tunnels. We could do quite a little bit there. One thing we did, we got a ceramic heater, you know, gas fired for hours, and finally got good and hot, and then you blow the air through those pebbles, and really, not really pebbles, they were like
marbles,
bigger than that, golf ball to even bigger. You had to have you had to be careful that you did block the flow too much, because the whole dang works would come out. In 2 or 3 places across the country that happened. One place, I can't remember where it was now, where they came out and they were using thorium, and thorium is radioactive, and it sprayed all out over a half a mile. And so we decided we wouldn't use thorium, because God, even though Rosemount was out in the country, we wouldn't have the resources to clean it up. So we went with, I forget the material, but it wasn't radioactive, and it wasn't quite as hot. Mm-hmm. But anyway, we decided that's the way to go. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Rosemount was out of the country then. Yeah. What it was, during the war, it had been a factory for doing gunpowder and stuff like that, and had tremendous facilities. And so Ackerman was the head of the department, the Aero department in Minnesota, and he was kind of a far-thinking guy, and he had a chance to get that. And he looked at those pumps and all that sort of thing, and said, gee, it's just an ideal place to do research. And you know, if you needed a pump, you could scrounge around, because the building the gunpowder required evaporators and pumps and you name it.
It's almost like a little Redstone.
Yeah, it was a munition factory, really, is what it was.
Well, that's what Redstone
was. And they
was.
declared it surplus, and the university got it. And it was something like 6,000 acres. So they also went ahead and continued with made a agricultural station out of it. There, you know, was a lot more than just the aeronautical. But anyway, the aeronautical department at the University of Minnesota got it, and they started developing wind tunnels.
Well, when you got to Huntsville, it was just after the Apollo program had been started, or the president had announced the objective of putting people on the moon and returning them. Did the problems you got involved in here relate to that mission?
Some of it, yes. There were ones that did studies on trajectories and things along that order. Once we got a good computer, man, those people that were hep on that really, you know, got going on that. And
so you had a better computer than the Army did at that time?
Well, they had a good computer, but the computer we had at that time was state of the art, and half a shift on that was just really more than we needed, you know.
So you helped with the trajectory.
One thing we did to help ourselves, and I kind of instigated that. Somebody says, "What could you do to help us, you know, companies?" And I wound up selling computer time up to about $200,000 a year for several years. Finally, then it got so everybody could get a computer, and that died out. But it really helped.
Mm-hmm. Well, later you became, I guess, Associate Dean of Engineering?
No.
What was the title?
Yeah, I did become Associate Dean of Engineering. That's correct, yes.
And helped a lot with the students, as I remember?
One of my... well, I was still in the Research Institute. the technical services like the shops and the radioisotopes, the grants and contracts and so forth were all under my purview, and the computer. And I forget what else, but anyway.
Well, that's quite ample already.
Inventions.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
You had your hands full there.
It turned out it was a fairly good concept that you'd have a central organization that would do the technical services for anybody. And so I had technicians, and one of the physicists, I don't say he reported to me, but he had more knowledge. I had taken a course in the Army on radiation safety, so it wasn't that I was completely ignorant, but I didn't have the really depth of background that a physicist would have that was studying that sort of thing. So it had helped that way.
And then you moved into more of the engineering support, or the support of the Dean of Engineering, as I remember it. And I think you were with the engineering school when you retired, were you not?
That's correct, yeah. I retired, I believe it was in '98. And I started here in '62, so that was 36 years. Now, the last 4 or 5 years, I had retired, but I also had a half-time appointment. But I was out here nearly all the time anyway. So.
Well, you were really one of the pioneers that started UAH. Coming back to the period during the Rudolph Herman days at the Research Institute, remember any particular outstanding results that came out of the research of the Institute at that time? That's probably an unfair question.
Yeah, it's just hard to say. The concept we had for cooling, I think, was a very good one. But anyway, eventually it was the tiles rather than, see, that's a passive system, and our steam you had to pump water out, and it would flow back over. And
eventually Apollo used ablation.
Yeah.
Well, there was still a material going back over, except it melted off the shield.
Yeah.
Did Rudolph Herman and you have many interactions with von Braun during that period?
Yeah, he helped us get started.
But after you got started, did Rudolph and Werner get together occasionally, or?
Well, they were, in a sense, buddies. They go way back to Peenemünde.
Right, yeah, I understand that. In fact, as I understand it from Rudolph Herman's memoirs, they were parallel. They both reported directly to General Dornberger at Peenemünde.
Yeah. See, Herman had designed and had built in Germany a supersonic wind tunnel that was eventually taken over by the Navy and brought to this country.
And I think one of our earlier interviewees said that at least the smaller of those tunnels eventually came to the Army and was used at Redstone and is now at Auburn.
Oh, I don't know. It's possible. No, Herman used to have on his desk a little model about this size of the V2, and that model was the aerodynamic testing of the V2, just that size model. But everybody knows what the V2 wound up.
Well, in some of the literature, or I guess all of the literature, Dornberger, for instance, Rudolph Herman is credited with having solved the aerodynamics problems that made the V2 possible. And that's rather clearly stated in some of those documents. He loved music.
And he liked to dance.
Can you comment on that?
Well, I never did hear him play. You know, I went to his house many times, but
what instruments did he play? Do you know?
I think he played the violin.
Violin. His father was a violin teacher, so I assume he learned the violin from his father. Well, did you have interactions with Rudolph after he retired? He did a lot of things after he retired. Taught astronomy, of course.
Yeah. I'd see him fairly regular, and you know, just social occasions.
Mm-hmm. I guess you were at his 80th birthday party.
Yeah.
As many of us were.
Yeah.
That was a very nice event.
I used to go water skiing with him and his wife Maya.
Uh-huh.
And his first wife, I forgot her name now. She was very formal and just, you know, right, that sort of thing. Kind of, you know. And I remember when he finally got married, and I didn't know what to say. The second wife. And so I didn't want to say congratulations. I says, well, I wish you happiness. And he says, everybody needs it. So evidently she was just a little too, first wife was just a little too formal for him, I think.
Okay. She was a academic type also.
She had a PhD in history. So, you know, it's quite a family. Now, one of his sons ran a business of taking relatively small streams and converting them to power, the small dam power companies. And the other one was airline pilot, and he's finally retired. So.
Well, you were surely one of the pioneers that helped get UAH underway during those early years. Is there anything more you'd like to add by way of reminiscence?
When I came here, there was one building. It was Morton Hall, and it was about half or less than half the size it is now. And all this has come since.
You've really been a pioneer in helping get the university started. We all thank you for doing so. The city of Huntsville and the community needed the university, and you're one of the key people that helped bring it about. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you.
Thank you for coming in.
Okay.